And I'd like to welcome everyone to Sunday School once again this morning. Hopefully everyone's again had a good weekend. At least we got a couple of days with no rain. That's a nice change of pace for a while. Sister Dana, would you mind opening our class with prayer for us this morning, please? And again, today we're still in our quarter of study on the minor prophets. And before we look at the lesson today, just to give you some historical time frame, basically the minor prophets cover from around, began with Obadiah, which was around 840 BC. It ends, well, Malachi is the last one, that's in 430. So it's about a 400-year stretch, and it's divided into three sections. The reason I'm picking today to go through this, last week with Habakkuk, we ended the first division, if you will, of time. That was the pre-exilic period. It was before all of the prophets we've studied up until today were before the exile of Babylon. They were all prophesying about the fact that that was going to occur and things along that line. And then during the exile period, which was roughly 586 to 538, it was 70 years, they were, give or take a little bit, they were in exile. And there were no minor prophets. I mean, again, there were prophets that we designate a minor, major. But during the exile period, Daniel and Ezekiel were the main, the prophets that prophesied during that time. And of course, we're not looking at those particular prophets in this quarter of study. And our prophet today is Haggai, and he is the first prophet as the post-exilic part of history for the Jews. So this is after they're returning from the Babylonian exile. The main reason I think that's important is if you look at what they're doing when they come back, I think his prophecy is dealing with their response to the fact that they're returning to Jerusalem. They're no longer in exile. So the first few prophets we studied, we're looking at before they went into exile. Then you got Daniel, Ezekiel during the exile. And then Haggai is the first spokesman for God as one of the minor prophets upon their return to Jerusalem. That period is from roughly 438 to 530, give or take a little bit. So Haggai, the prophet we're looking at today, his name means festival. I'm thinking that's an appropriate name because there ought to be some festivities going on. They're on their way back to Jerusalem. They got to be excited about that. Haggai is the easiest to date of all the prophets we've studied so far because he began speaking for Jehovah in the second year of Darius the king on the first day of the 6th month. So that's in Haggai 1:1. So that makes it pretty easy to date when he is. It's pretty specific. It's the first day of the 6th month of King Darius's reign. Darius the Great, that's the ruler they're talking about. He's also known as Darius the First or Darius Hestapes. That's another name for him. We shouldn't confuse him with Darius the Mede. That's whom Cyprus placed on the throne after he conquered Babylon, and who reluctantly is the king who threw Daniel into the lion's den. That's that Darius. But the Darius of Haggai's day sees the Persian kingdom following the death of Cyrus and subsequent weak years of his son Cambyses. So Darius the First, the one during Haggai's time, reigned from 522 to 486 BC. So we get the date for Haggai's preaching, as well as Zechariah, who's coming up, would be 520 BC. Again, the first day of the 6th month of the reign of Darius the First. All right, so easy enough to date. And the main prophecy of Haggai is summed up in 3 words. Build the temple. That's the prophecy. Haggai preached a little less than 4 months. When he was prophesying and preaching, the people had neglected the Lord's house for 16 years. So they've been back from exile, back in Jerusalem again, 16 years before Haggai comes talk to them. So they were busying themselves mostly with their own interest. They convinced themselves that it wasn't the right time yet for the building of the house of the Lord. It wasn't time to rebuild it. Haggai 1:2-4. And because of their neglect, again, they're out of exile. You think they should be excited and ecstatic about all that. But God was punishing them right out the bat with a drought because they were neglecting his house. They were more worried about their house. So by inspiration, a little later in chapter 2, Haggai links his urging of the temple's completion to the future glory of the Messiah's reign in his house. So this is a reference to the establishment of the New Testament church, the reign of Christ. It's quoted and the application of Haggai 2:6 in the writer of Hebrews. I'm not going to take time to read it for the lesson, but Hebrews 12:26 and 28 talks about Haggai's prophecy. So Haggai takes his place along all the other minor prophets who also uttered messianic prophecies. So some of it is messianic and some of it is particularly for that day. Again, the message that he has for the people is build the temple. You can put an exclamation point on the end of it, I think, too, when you listen to what he has to say. So the lesson we're going to look at today was titled Putting First Things First. It's by a pastor named Rick Ezel. We've actually did, one of our other prophets came from, in fact, as I think Obadiah did, from the same guy. And again, I'm not promoting the preacher or anything. I'm just want to give credit to who's credit due. So in his sermon, he talks about a guy named Ian Gray. He just quoted his name, but I looked him up. Ian Gray was an official of the Prudential Life Insurance Company of America. And he spent his entire life searching for the one trait that all successful people share. So this guy, Ian Gray, he had an essay entitled The Common Denominator of Success. This was part of an address that he made in 1940 at the National Association of Life Underwriters annual convention in Philadelphia. So again, he's not a preacher, but he has some very, very good things to say. In this essay, again, it was titled The Common Denominator of Success. He revealed that successful people's common characteristic was not hard work, it wasn't good luck, it wasn't astute human relations. These things, they're important. He even said that in his essay. They matter. But the one factor that seemed to transcend all of the others was the habit of putting first things first. He observed, this is a quote from Ian Gray, the successful person has the habit of doing the things failures don't like to do. They don't like doing them either necessarily, but their dislike is subordinate to the strength of their purpose. I think that's a good quote that we could apply scripturally. And again, he's an insurance salesman, but I think it does fit in with the plan. I'm going to read that quote again. The successful person has the habit of doing things failures don't like to do. They don't like doing them either necessarily, but their disliking is subordinate to the strength of their purpose. They do the stuff they have to do. Well, in my mind, I'm thinking as a Christian, that should be our goal too. Our goal is what God told us to do, whether we like it or not. A successful Christian is the one who does what God told him to do, whether they like it or not. Sometimes God's called me to do stuff and I'm like, you want me to do what? Really? That doesn't make any sense. But without fail, every time I did do what I was supposed to do, yeah, I was successful every single time. Sometimes I have failed in the past, but it's because I didn't do what I tried to do something else. And when I try to do something else, that's a disaster. We got to do what God says. So first things first, the first thing needs to be God and what God said. So the book of Haggai, again, it's the second shortest book in the Old Testament. It communicates the same message that Ian Gray had, which was put first things first. This book is written to people who are just like us. People who would say that God must be first, but then drifted away from the truth that God is first. They live with misplaced priorities. Haggai was sent to help God's people get their priorities in line with what they already knew they should be. I'm thinking forward to today. Does that sound like a large portion of the, quote, church today? I gave that analogy in plenty of Sunday school lessons over the years. I've heard people tell me, I ask them if they know about the Lord. Are you a Christian? Yeah, I live in America, don't I? They say they are. They think they are. but their priorities aren't straight. They're claiming God's first, yet if you look at their life for 3 seconds, you can tell that God's not first, something else is. That's where Israel was on the return from exile. And I'm thinking in my mind, I'm like, man, they've been in captivity for 70 years. It seems like they'd be so on fire for God. They'd be doing everything God said. And in effect, they were doing everything except for what God said. So Haggai spoke this message to the Jews who had returned to Jerusalem, again, after captivity in Babylon. Again, historically, Babylon destroyed Jerusalem. They destroyed Solomon's temple in the time frame of Haggai 70 years earlier. So it was it was a lifetime ago for a whole generation's come and gone. So when the Jews returned from exile, they faced the daunting task of rebuilding. Jerusalem's been destroyed. It's rubble. On Wednesday night, we've been kind of studying that for a while, and we've also been studying in the lessons on the circle's almost complete. They're studying a little bit later in history than what this is. This is after the temple's built, when they're building the wall. But when they first came back, the first returnees, they made preliminary attempts to clear the debris and lay a foundation for the temple. Again, I told you Ezra was in the captivity period. It's Ezra 3:8. Right when they came back, they started rebuilding the temple. The Samaritan neighbors offered to join in the work to help them. Now, y'all remember they don't get along good with the Samaritans. So the Jews refused their help. So then the Samaritans, in turn, threatened the workers. They sent men to Persia, which is the new world power because Babylon is on the out. Persia's coming to being. And they lobbied against the Jews, and that brought a halt to the building of the temple. So they're out of exile, they're in Jerusalem, they start building the temple, then it comes to a halt because of the way they were dealing with people. So years passed, and kind of slowly but surely they did. Jerusalem started to come back to life again. It takes a while. Their homes were built, their stores were open, commerce was established, fields were planted, crops were harvested. Life began to be normal. Now keep in mind though, they started the temple and stopped. And then life goes on, they build their houses, they build the stores, and Israel's starting to come back into an actual city again. Where's the temple? It's just a foundation. Israel got used to life without the temple. When they came, going back to Ezra again, the first thing they were supposed to do was build the temple. They started with it, got a foundation laid, and then stopped. Again, I'm thinking today, how does that not describe a lot of, quote, Christians today? They start good. They come out of that life of sin. They come to know the Lord. They fired up. 2 or 3 years later, they're not quite as fired up. 5 or 6 years later, they ain't fired up at all. 10 or 20 years later, some of them are right back out there where they were in the world to begin with. That's kind of what happened to Jerusalem. The foundation became overgrown with weeds. That made me think of the parable of the sower. They on fire, they building the temple. But because it was in shallow ground, it didn't get in their head good what they were doing, the weeds choked it out. Literally, the weeds choked out the desire, and now it's just a foundation covered in that. So the foundation of the temple stood as a mute reminder of the Jews' failure to take care of God's house. This is where Haggai comes on the scene. It's about 14 to 16 years from when they first got there. They started building the temple. 15, 16 years, somewhere in that neighborhood, passes by, and then Haggai comes on the scene with one prevailing message. His message was, it's time to finish rebuilding the temple. In my mind, too, I'm thinking, look how patient the Lord is. He let them go 15, 16 years, not doing what they're supposed to do, and finally he's like, all right, people, come on. You should have built this temple 15 years ago. That, in a paraphrase, that's what Haggai is telling them. Haggai's message became a message about your priorities. Going back to the title again, put first things first. The temple was the center for worshiping God. Again, try to put yourself in their steps. They've been in exile for 70 years. They know the prophets before Haggai were telling them the truth. How do they know? Because Babylon came and destroyed Jerusalem and they got hauled off into captivity. Exactly what these other prophets told them happened. They knew. And the new prophet, Ezra, had been telling them, you need to go, you're coming out of exile, go back and build the temple. the temple represented the heart and the soul of the Old Testament religion, of the Jewish religion itself. Although God is everywhere, the temple was the place on earth where God dwelled in a special sense. Now again, we're not talking about like in Moses' day and Joshua's day and shortly thereafter when there wasn't a temple, it was in a tabernacle, they moved around a lot. We're not even talking about in Solomon's day. The temple has already been built. They know what it is. Solomon built it. But that temple was destroyed. Now they need the temple rebuilt. So for the temple to lie in ruins was in effect to neglect the worship of God. That's the place where they were supposed to worship God. I know it's not so much for Christianity today, but in that time frame, the temple represented the presence of God. That's where they went. So this became a testimony of Israel's misplaced priorities. In effect, it's an embarrassment. It's a blemish on the reputation of a holy God that they come out of exile. God's delivered them again. We can rehearse all the Old Testament stuff if you want. He redeemed them time after time after time. Here they are. God's back with them. And they don't even finish building the temple. Again, I put that forward to today. God's delivered you. God's delivered me. What are we doing about it? Our body is the temple. Is it evident that the temple is for God's glory or not? Where are we? So Haggai's message was pretty blunt. He really didn't kind of pull punches or waste any words. In my mind, I see Haggai like a foreman on a construction project. He's got his hard hat on, his tool belt, walking around with construction site, bellowing out orders to everybody. Get busy, go over here, get that, order this, send that, find that, build this. Look over here, that don't look right, put it over here, move it over. That's how I see him. And I think in Haggai's message, we can find a couple of practical steps about putting first things first. So the first point in our lesson we want to look at is we got to stop making excuses. First and foremost, Haggai confronted the excuses that the people had for the temple lying in ruins. Everybody knew where the temple was. Everybody saw that foundation all the time when they walked by it. Everybody saw it overgrown with weeds. And everybody made excuses for why they're not finishing it. It's in Haggai 1 verse 2. Thus speaketh the Lord of hosts, saying, this people say, the time is not come, the time that the Lord's house should be built. So they came there 15, 16 years ago. They intended to build God's house, but they just hadn't got around to it yet. That's their excuse. I'm going to get... Anybody besides me ever had their spouse ask them to do something and you're like, I'm going to get to it. And then a week or two later, they ask you to do the same thing and I'm going to get to it. I can't be the only one who has that problem. Brother Steve, you don't have that problem? I'm going to get to it. Sometimes you got to stop what you're doing and get to it. My grandpa, I looked for it, but I couldn't find it. I've got one somewhere. My grandpa had these little circle discs about the size of a $50. They were wooden. And on the wooden disc, in quotes, it had T-U-I-T in big capital letters in quotes. And it was on both sides of this little, it was about the size, I wish I could have found it. I was looking, I know I got it in a box somewhere. And he would hand me that whenever he wanted me to do something and I hadn't done it yet, he'd give me one of these little things. And the first time he gave me one, I'm like, to it? He's like, yeah, that's an around to it. So you can get, that's a round to it. So you can get busy doing what I told you to do. I'm like, okay, well, we need to get around to it. Like I said, I wish I had mine. I got a few of y'all I could have gave it to and you could have did it. Yeah, if you were to ask the Jews of Haggai's day and ask them about building the temple, they would probably say something like this. Yes, that's a great idea. We need to build the temple. It's a great cause. But you know, God also wants us to take care of our families. You know, times are hard right now. Jobs are kind of scarce. Maybe we better pray about that some more before we get busy. That sound familiar like people today? We will eventually build it, just not right now. So they begin to make excuses is basically what it's saying. Billy Sunday, a famous evangelist, he defined an excuse like this. An excuse is the skin of reason stuffed with a lie. Benjamin Franklin wrote this. I never knew a man who was good at making excuses who is good at anything else. That's a pretty good thing too. I have a little sign on the wall in my band room. It says, an excuse is your verbal display of your inadequacy to perform a simple task when called upon to do it. That all of those kind of sum it up. It's way easier for most people to make excuses, especially when you don't want to obey God to begin with. Y'all do know this flesh, this body, aside from Christ, doesn't want to do what God says ever. So excuses become easy. For some people, excuses are so second nature, they never do anything at all. They just constantly go through life making excuses. Anybody know anybody like that? Anybody ever tried to go to work with somebody like that? Anybody besides me think those people are extremely annoying? Because what happens when the people you work with are always making excuses? That means you get to do it. Look, I'll do whatever God called me to do, but I don't want to do what God called you to do because you won't do it. I got enough to do. I mean, in effect, that's where we find Israel at this time. They're making excuses to not build the temple. Since Calvary, since that day, God lives in His people, so the temple is us. We can always find rational justification for not doing what God wants us to do. Look, the devil, he's sneaky and tricky. If you want a reason not to do something God said for you to do, the devil will get in your ear and give you time after time thousands of reasons not to do it. The devil don't care what you believe as long as you don't believe in Christ. The devil don't care what you do as long as you're not doing what God told you to do. You can do good things, but if those good things aren't what God told you to do, they're not good things, or they're definitely not the best things. Their excuses, the time's not right. I've got responsibilities. My kids need me right now. As soon as my kids get out of school, anybody besides me ever said, oh, well, I'm going to get around that after I get married. I'll do that after we have children. When my children are out of high school. When my children get out of college. Well, you know, it's rough. I got to help my kid at their work. All these excuses. When things settle down at work, I'll get busy and do what you want me to do, Lord. So the first thing to putting first things first is to admit you have a responsibility to begin with. Christians are responsible for demonstrating and showing Jesus Christ to this world. That's our responsibility, to show Christ to this world. In Haggai's day, the temple was a big display of God and who He is. And they didn't build it. It was just a slab with a bunch of weeds growing all over it. Some of us are just a little bit of a foundation with a bunch of weeds growing all over the top of it. We got to get the weed eater out and take care of all that mess and get busy building. Stop making excuses. In effect, there are none. If everybody really realized the importance of that, there's coming a day when you're going to stand before Christ and He's going to say, I fixed the entire world for you. Why you didn't do what I asked? You can stutter and stammer all you want, but none of it's going to be a valid excuse. Because if He told you to do it, He gave you what you need to do it. He gave you the time to do it. He showed you how to do it. He did everything for you to do it. You just didn't do it. That'll bring us to our second point. Number one is stop making excuses. Number two is cease being selfish. This is closely aligned with excuse making, is a selfish mindset. That kind of mindset in Haggai's day was a problem. You can't deny the fact that it's definitely a problem today. That mindset of selfishness. So Haggai began to challenge the people's selfish behavior. Haggai 1 verse 3. Then came the word of the Lord by Haggai the prophet, saying, Is it time for you, O ye, to dwell in your ceaseled houses, and this house lie in waste? That word ceaseled, I looked it up, and it means, or should mean, covered or roofed, or in other translations it says paneled houses. But the point of that is that ceaseled roofs is representative of the finishing touches of the building. Your building's not only built, It's adorned and decorated and everything. All the pictures are hanging in the right places in your living room. All the walls are, everything's perfect. So their homes, the people's homes, were not in process. They were completed. They were done. No weeds growing around their unfinished foundations. Their homes were completely finished while the temple was still non-existent. The foundation was there. To me, I'm thinking there's people, the foundation's there. They've heard the preaching. They've sang the songs. They know who the Lord is. They're open to the fact, but they're not building anything on it. They're just sitting right there with what they got. Again, nothing's wrong with having a nice home. This is not like an attack on riches or big houses or cars or whatever, none of that. What's wrong is to own a nice home while God's home lies in ruins. That shows where your priorities are. To me, if you got a nice house and you're not paying your tithes, you've got a problem. If your tithes are the reason you can afford to live in a nice house, you've got a bigger problem. This is basically what Haggai is telling the people, the Jews here. My house is a total ruin. Your house is finished and done. What are you waiting on? What is wrong with that kind of attitude is if you spend all your money on selfish needs and ignore the things of God. What is wrong to spend all of your time, all of your best hours, all of your talents on selfish pursuits while the things of God are undone. That's an indictment of misplaced priorities. Again, the title, Put First Things First. It's easy to drift away from God's agenda into your own agenda. It's easy to pursue your selfish desires while ignoring God's desires. This flesh only wants to please itself. How do you solve that? You crucify this flesh, accept the Lord. He takes his place in your heart, and then his desire becomes important. That's what Haggai is telling them. You're missing the mark. You got out of exile, you forgot, you just came out of captivity and you were miserable and you hated it. Now you're here because of God's grace and glory, and now you're ignoring God's grace and glory and not building this house. What you think's going to happen if you don't get busy building God's house sooner or later? In fact, this kind of attitude of selfish desire is the default mode of mankind. That's what we're born into. If we give no thought to how we are living, then you're naturally going to live for yourself. So the bent of our heart is always towards selfishness. This is what happened to the Jews, and this is what Haggai is addressing. And again, I'm thinking, look at where they are. They had all these prophets telling them Jerusalem's going to be overrun. You're going into captivity. Nobody believed them. Now they're in captivity. They're in captivity. They're miserable. They want to get out of captivity. They do. You'd think they'd turn to the Lord wholeheartedly, but they didn't. Before we're too hard on the Jews, guess what we do all the time? Anybody besides me in their younger days when you didn't know any better, prayed, "Dear Lord, if you'll help me out of this, I'll never miss church again." And he helps you out of it, and a couple of weeks later, you're missing church again. That's because our mindset is not there. You have to work to improve that. There's a hymn by Robert Robinson. I like the old hymns sometimes. They got some good stuff in there. As a kid, we sang them all the time in the Baptist church. I never realized till I got older and started actually looking at the hymns. We did that quarter study on hymns a while back. I never realized till looking at how much scripture I memorized because I knew the song. When I got older and actually started reading my Bible every day instead of just pretending to, and I actually started reading, I'd be reading something, and I'm reading it, and I'm finishing the verse in my head, and I'm like, man, I know that. And a few minutes later, it would click in my head, oh, that's this song. And I knew it because of that. Here's a song by Robert Robertson. It's called "Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing." Most of us probably know that song. It's getting a little old, maybe not. But here's the third stanza of that hymn. "Prone to wander, Lord, I feel it. Prone to leave the God I love." Think about those words. That's what happens when we don't persistently and consistently seek God first. First things first. If you get God out of first, guess what? You're going to wander every time. Don't think for a minute you can put God on the back burner and he's not going to get further on the back burner. Look, God's either going to be first or he's not going to be there at all. He's not going to be second. Sorry, he's not going to be second to your spouse. He's not going to be second to your kids. He's not going to be second to your mom or your daddy. He ain't going to be second to nobody. He's either going to be first or he's not there. Basically, that's what Haggai is telling them. The foundation's here. It's laid for you. We got that much. And now you're ignoring what you already know, and you're getting further and further and further to the point that you finished all your stuff and you ain't even finished his stuff. That'll bring us to the third point of the lesson, is don't miss out on God's blessing. So as a consequence, that word consequence, our world today don't want to hear about that word. Listen, I hear kids at school all the time say, well, I got the right. I can do, you do whatever you want. But the consequences of what you do are not determined by you. They're determined by what God said. God said if you obey him and follow him, that blessings follow. God also said if you disobey him, that judgment follows. You're not going to do, you can do anything you want to do. Go ahead, God gives you free will. But you don't pick what happens because of what you do. God, and the good news is for you, this book lays out exactly what happens for everything you choose. If you're trying to make a decision in your life and you're not sure what you ought to do, the answer's in here. And it tells you what's going to happen if you pick A. It tells you what happens if you pick B. Our problem is we want to pick B and ignore the consequences. You don't get to ignore them. They might be delayed. We talked about that in a couple of the previous prophets. Sometimes it's delayed, but it's coming. So don't miss God's blessing. There are consequences. And their excuse-making and selfish living in Haggai's day brought consequences. They began to experience hardship. Now think about it again. I know I've said this 2 or 3 times, but I don't want to lose sight of this. They just came out of exile. They've returned. And they there 10 or 15 years, and already they're being punished by God again. They didn't last long. Here's what it says in Haggai 1:5. Now therefore, thus saith the Lord of hosts, consider your ways. Ye have sown much and bring in little. Ye eat, but ye have not enough. Ye drink, but you are not filled with drink. Ye clothe you, but there is none warm. And he that earneth wages to put it into a bag with holes. Paraphrasing what he's saying. You sowed plenty of seed, but there's a drought, and your crops don't yield what you think they should or what they ought to. They had active lifestyles, but they were not satisfied with that lifestyle. They were laboring, but showing no profit. No matter how hard they tried, they seemed to just be spinning their wheels. No matter how much money they made, they couldn't keep it. Anybody know how that feels? We find ourselves sometimes in that way. So because of their selfishness, the people were missing out on God's blessings. Just in my mind. You think God brought them out of exile just to put them in a place of mediocrity? You think God brought them out of Babylonian captivity and put them back in Jerusalem so they could be miserable and not have enough food and not have enough of the things they need? That's where they were. Was it God's fault? It's their fault. They don't have their priorities straight. So the consequences of not doing what God's told them to do are showing in their daily lives. Haggai points out a sobering reminder. What happens in your heart affects every other part of your life. All of them. I've been studying in these lessons and thinking a little bit about your heart and your mind and how people view it. This is just me, all right? And I still hadn't studied it out. But it seems like in Scripture, the devil's always attacking your mind. He attacks your mind and your thinking and your thought process. But God's always dealing with your heart. I got to thinking about that a little bit. What happens in your heart affects every other part of your body. So what happens in your heart affects what's in your mind. See, we're worried about temporary things, and the devil's tricking us mentally into accepting these ideas. That's keeping our heart from changing. But if we can change our heart, that's what God came to do, your mind won't be far behind. We got to think about what goes into your heart. The people of God had pushed God out of the center of their heart. They didn't have a heart's desire for Him anymore. How do we know they didn't have a heart's desire for the Lord? Because the temple is still just a foundation overgrown with weeds, and their house is phenomenal. Their heart was their house. Their heart was their stuff. And Haggai is telling them from the Lord, you don't have first things first. Your first priority is you, but you're the creation. The Creator's got to be the first priority. What they didn't see was that God, who put them in exile, is also the God who's got them in this state of drought where they're not able to do anything. They hadn't stopped to consider that God was trying to tell them something. In my mind, again, don't miss God's blessing here. Haggai is screaming at the top of his lungs, hey, it's God who controls the rain and the harvest. You're fussing about all this? God's in charge of that. He's withholding His blessing because your priorities aren't right. Put His house first, and He will bless you. That's a summary pretty much of what Haggai is saying in most of chapter 1. It's also the thing that Jesus said when He was walking here on this earth, Matthew 6:33. But seek ye first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you. I've read that verse quite a few times, but in the context of what Haggai is saying, it kind of took a little twist in my mind. Seek ye first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, all these things shall be added unto you. Basically, Jesus is saying the same thing Haggai is saying. Put first things first. God's first. Blessings come through obedience. If you want to experience God's blessings, then put your obedience to God first. If you're seeking the blessings, you're not going to get them. If you're seeking the Lord, you can't help but get them. I don't know if that makes any sense or not, but if you're seeking the Lord, don't worry about the blessings. They're going to be there. Not might be there, they will be. So we throw all our eggs into one basket of what I can do instead of just doing what God said and let Him take care of all the blessings and where you are. You upset with your job and don't like the way things are going? Look at what you're doing. Are you doing your job for the Lord, or are you doing the job to make money? I got to tell you, I was smart enough in school, I could have done just about anything I wanted to do. Fact is, I spent a year of college in studying engineering, and I was good at it. I'm sitting working all these little math problems. I'll just blow right through them. And then I said, you know what? I don't think I can sit here all day long just working math problems. I'm supposed to teach. I'm supposed to be a band director. And I changed my major and started being a band director. I'm going to tell you now, I taught 33 years, and it went by just like that. 2 seconds. I had people challenge me on that. I think I did what God told me to do for 33 years. I'm supposed to be a band director. I got to tell you, I may not be a billionaire, but I never one time skipped a meal. Fact is, I never one time ate a lousy meal. Well, occasionally I had to go to McDonald's, but all right. That'll bring it. Look, don't miss God's blessing. Be obedient. Do what He's called you to do. Fourth thing is take time to evaluate. So with this strong indictment and devastating predicament, the people begin to realize that they caused their own calamities. The people were ready to evaluate their situation. 2 times Haggai instructed the people, consider your ways. It's Haggai 1, 5, and 7. The word consider means to give careful thought to. It was time for the people to do some serious self-examination before the Lord. Haggai wanted the people to stop long enough in their busy schedules to evaluate their life in light of God's Word. What did God say about what you're doing? He wanted them to measure the consequences of their actions. So evaluation's a good thing. That's why teachers give tests. That's why employers hold job interviews. Socrates said it this way: the unexamined life is not worth living. Each day we need to evaluate how we spend our time, how we spend our money, how we use our talents. We should examine who we choose as friends, what we set as goals, where we're going. If God's not first, then guess who removed Him from His rightful place? You did. The failure to make constant corrections every day is like a pilot who doesn't make slight course adjustments during the flight. The plane will end up hundreds of miles off course. The failure to take proper precautions today will result in severe consequences tomorrow. I've been out in my boat before when I had just a compass, and the compass was bouncing around a little bit in the waves. I'm trying to stay on that compass. I get out there to the island I'm looking for. I'm 2 miles away from the island. When I finally get out there, I finally see it way over there. I'm lost for 20 minutes, can't figure out where I'm at. And then I see it, and I'm like, man, I missed that by, I started going this way, and I ended up going this way. This much on the compass is miles when you get out there. When we stop making excuses, cease being selfish, seek God's blessings, take time to evaluate, then we'll see God's at work. We'll see it crystal clear. This is what happens when first things are first. When God is first in your hearts, we will know that we have put, how will we know that we put first things first? How will we know that God is first place? There's some indications. Number one, we're active in the right things. Haggai 1:8. Go up to the mountain and bring wood and build the house, and I will take pleasure in it, and I will be glorified, saith the Lord. In all of life, there's a time to talk, a time to laugh, a time to consider, a time to do. Those who put first things first are doing the right things, spending time with God daily, serving the people, honoring Him with your time, your talent, your finances. For the Jews in Jerusalem in Haggai's day, it meant cutting down trees and building God's house. Secondly, God will be glorified. Why should the temple be built? That God could be glorified. When God is not first, we are indifferent to His glory, His fame and His reputation being spread. When God is first, revealing His glory becomes first on our minds. In fact, everything we say and do is to honor God and bring credit to Him. Whatever your occupation, the chief businessman, the doctor, lawyer, band director, and every Christian should bring glory to God in the things they're doing. Thirdly, God blesses us. When the people obeyed, God sent word. I am with you, saith the Lord. That's chapter 1, verse 13. So when God is first, He blesses us. And the sure sign of His blessing was His manifested presence. If God seems distant in your life, perhaps it's because your priorities are mixed up. When you put God first, you experience a new awareness of His presence. That is true blessings. So in conclusion, I got a story from you there was an instructor at a time management seminar. He told the participants to prepare for a short quiz. And he reached under the table and took out this big wide-mouthed gallon jar, put it on a table, and next to the jar on the table were a bunch of fist-sized rocks. And he asked the group, how many of these rocks do you think I can get in the jar? Boy, they all made guesses as to how many. So he said, let's find out. So he started putting these big rocks into the jar, many fist-sized rocks as he could, until the rocks were level with the top of the jar. Then the instructor said, is the jar full? Everybody was like, well, yeah, you filled it to the top. So then he reached under the table and took out a bucket of gravel. And he started dumping the gravel in the jar and shook the jar as he poured gravel in, and the gravel filled the spaces between the big rocks. So then the instructor grins, all right, is the jar full? So they aren't going to be fooled a second time. They said, no, the jar's probably not full. So the instructor said, okay, you're kind of catching on. So he took out a bucket of sand and poured that into the jar and shook the jar a little bit. And the sand filled the gaps between the rocks and the gravel. And once the sand settled at the top, he said, now is the jar full? Everybody said, well, no, not yet. He said, good, you're kind of getting the idea. You're getting the principle. So he poured a pitcher of water into the jar. And at this point, he stopped when the water came level to the top and asked everybody, what's the point of this? Why am I doing this? Anybody knows? I'm just curious if y'all get what the point of it is. Here's what some of them said. Most of them said, well, I think the point is there's always gaps. And if you work at it, you can always fit more into your life. How many of y'all think that's a good answer? I mean, that sounds reasonable to me. But the instructor said, no, you're missing the point altogether. The point is, if I had not put the big rocks first, I'd have never got half that much in that jar. You got to put the big rocks first. You can't put God first. If you put God in first, you can pour all that other stuff in there and it'll all fit. But if you put that same amount of sand in the jar first, you ain't going to get near that much rocks in there. Not near at all. There is room for everything in your life if it's in the correct order. All your desires, even what you want, there's room for it. What should be the big rocks? The big rocks is God and His house. Put God first, and the rest of your life, leave it in God's hands, and the rest of your life you'll have everything you desire and need. Put God first. Again, Haggai's message, first things first. Thank you all very much, and look forward to seeing y'all next week, and we've got 2 more prophets to go, and we'll be done with them. Thank you.